From recruiting and consulting firm Riderflex, I'm your host, Steve Urban, and here is your Riderflex episode of the day. And on today's episode of the Riderflex podcast, we have Marc Gutman, the founder and chief storyteller of WILDSTORY, based in Colorado. Marc, how you doing today?
Great, Steve. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and really looking forward to our conversation.
You know, I've done a lot of these interviews on the Riderflex podcast already, and I've been interviewing people my whole life. I'm 52, so almost 30 years of interviewing. But when I was preparing for yours, I got to tell you, I got a little nervous because I'm like, okay, I'm interviewing the master storyteller. Like I'm interviewing a guy who does this stuff for a living, tells stories. And as I was preparing, I thought, man, I hope I'm good enough for Marc.
Well, that's a lot of pressure, but I really think that I'm no different than everyone else, where we have the ability to interview others. We have the ability to look at others and really boil down their story, but it's really hard to talk about ourselves. And it's really hard to talk about our own stories. So I'm no different. And I, we might get to it in a little bit, but last year I challenged myself by performing some stand-up comedy in New York City.
Oh,
and
cool.
that was a really big challenge because I don't like to talk about myself. I don't like to be on stage. I like to be behind the camera. And so just like most people, it's easy to interview others, but hard to talk about myself. But I am excited to share my story today.
So if you're like me, if you're in at a dinner party, let's say you walk up to, you've been introduced to somebody, there's that first 2 minutes where you're trying to talk or whatever. Man, I always push it to them, right? Like I'll immediately try to get them to talk about themselves because I don't want to talk about me.
100%, always. Yeah. I want to know more about you than I want to tell you about me. And I think there's some people that inherently think that they're interesting, but I don't, I don't think like what I do is interesting until other people reflect back to me that they think it is. So, and I think that's a pretty common trait. Do
we also have this in common? I'll be with my wife at a social gathering. And because I was a long-term executive and just, like I said, interviewed people my whole life, she'll start elbowing me. She'll kind of whisper in my ear. She's like, stop interviewing people. She's like, you've asked them 15 questions in a row. Will you please stop?
we do share that trait. And I also like to dig, and not in the, not for a reason to be sensational or to scratch an itch, no. But I like, I'm kind of at a point in my life where like I superficial conversation isn't as interesting to me anymore. So
right?
I really want to get to know people and try to get to know people quickly. And but my wife does the same thing. She's like, you shouldn't ask that. Well, and she doesn't sound like that, by the way. Sorry about that, Lindsay.
Tell us about Marc before we get into WILDSTORY. Give us some early history, right? Where you grew up, stuff about your family, things like that.
Yeah. So I grew up in suburban Detroit in a little town called Troy. And, I like to say like nothing really ever happened. It was a really good upbringing, it was a pretty suburban, we could talk about this later too, but teenage sex comedy kind of upbringing, right? Like
right.
that was like what my experience was. And from a very early age, I always had this interest in movies, and I have this really distinct memory that when I was about 9 years old, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my dad in Detroit, and I looked at him and I was like, Dad, do you love your job? And he looked at me and he said, yeah, I love my job. And I was like, even as a 9-year-old, I was pretty perceptive, and I was like, yeah, do you love your job? And he said something to the effect of, Marc, if you were to love your job, they wouldn't call it work, If it was supposed to be fun, they wouldn't call it work. And from that moment on, I was on this quest to really love what I do.
Great.
And that really shaped me, and so
what did he do, by the way?
He was an attorney.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right.
But like kind of, he was an attorney, he worked at, for different law firms and things like that.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, he had his own practice. He had opened up a bike shop. He had all these like kind of entrepreneurial ventures.
All right.
He always reflected back to me how terrible being an entrepreneur was. So like, he didn't model that it was great. He, the things that I remember were that he would tell me that, everyone got paid first before him. And that he didn't have a good experience. So I find it very interesting that I ended up as an entrepreneur because it wasn't like I had this model that was like this shining light. It was actually the opposite. And so
interesting.
But, something really positive I did get from my father is we really shared this love of movies. That's how we
Okay.
really connected. It's really how I saw the world. As I mentioned, nothing really ever happened in suburban Detroit. So like I learned everything I know from TV and movies. Like my parents never sat me down and had that conversation about the birds and the bees. I learned that from the movies. Like I didn't, right or wrongly, I didn't really learn about how to like have interpersonal relationships. I learned that from the movies, and I was just always really, really fascinated with that. And so,
and you grew up in the 80s, late 80s in high school, graduated in 90, 91, something like that?
Exactly. Yep. 91.
Okay.
So,
All right.
coming out of that, I thought all my friends, I went to the University of Michigan. All my friends were getting, applying for jobs, either Goldman Sachs or going on to be professionals. And that was what my parents had, I think, really hoped for me. That was supposed to be my path, was to go get a job and be stable, because that's what they knew. And
how did you decide to major in English and literature? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, great question. Great question. So when high school was kind of an easy route for me, and I don't recommend that for other people, because it didn't set me up well for college, and I didn't know, because I had this upbringing, what I thought I was supposed to do versus what I wanted to do. I set my intention as my major for economics at the University of Michigan.
Oh, really? You start? Okay. All right.
Yep. In economics, and I had an economics class, I believe it was like an AP level class in high school, and I did really well. So
okay, I
decided that, well, I guess if I'm supposed to be a professional, I'll do economics. And because I had done so well in high school, I had also determined that I didn't need to go to Econ 101 at the University of Michigan. And
bad idea.
No surprise. That was my first F. And my parents sat me down, and they really wanted to, how did this happen? Like, how did you fail this class? And after giving the standard answers that a kid gives their parents about blah, blah, blah. I mean, the real answer that I kind of I wasn't really passionate about it. I was really following this thing that I thought other people wanted me to follow. And so I went on a bit of a journey at university. And it was this amazing time where I got to do everything and try everything the university had to offer. I tried sculpture class. That was this incredible experience. I was a terrible sculptor, but I loved it. And it was really hard. We had to do our a realistic bust of ourselves. And you got graded with, the professor came around with calipers and put it on your nose and your head. And that's how you got graded, right? Like it was okay. It's really, but I was terrible, but I loved it. And then I got, I always had liked English. I just didn't think you could do anything with that degree. And so as I was reading, I read The Fountainhead for the first time. I was super enamored, not by the politics of the book and the ideologies, but like this idea of being an architect seemed amazing, and creating cities. And so I decided I want to be an architect. But I showed up at the architecture school, and they're like, well, have you taken math and physics? And I was like, oh no, I haven't done that. And I don't want to do that. And then I also, found, and I got, and I didn't think that film was this thing that I could actually do. But I fell into it at university, and met a professor, and I started making movies, and we had like 16 millimeter, movies we're cutting on film.
Okay. So you were in the, what was it called? Was it called drama or film classes, or what was it called?
It was, they had a film department.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was actually not acting, but more like, the filmmaking. So they had screenwriting classes that you would go off and you would actually make films. And there's a little bit of a history from famous people in the film industry at Michigan. And that professor at one point, sat me down, and he just looked at me and he was like, hey, I think you can do this. Cool. That was it.
Cool. Right? That was it. There's a major turning point for you right there. Okay.
Huge. Gave me the permission. I needed to hear that. My parents certainly weren't saying that. And I don't think, out of anything negative, I think they just wanted, me to have a more stable and traditional career. But that's all I needed to hear. And from that point on, I had dedicated myself to my English degree. I also had I'm a few credit hours shy of a cultural anthropology double major.
Okay.
And I can see how that, and reflecting back, really plays into my interest of different people and getting to understand cultures and really meeting people in an empathetic way, where they're at. And I left college, I think with about $1,000 in my pocket and an old Oldsmobile, and drove to LA.
Are you serious? Now, I want to just pause right there. Now, are you at home? Were you living at home still in school, or you'd already moved out with some friends by the time you graduated?
Well, I guess technically I was living at home. I mean, I
Okay.
lived at school when I went to college, but I when I was in between places, I was
So
living
you
at
go
home.
home. So you go home. I can almost visualize it. You're sitting there at the dining room table with and now the Oldsmobile is probably a car they helped you with, or that was your first vehicle or something. And you're like, hey, I'm gonna like take the $1,000 I saved up and drive the car, which is not super dependable, out to California and find a job. And your
Yep.
dad was like, well, what are you gonna do?
Yeah, what are you gonna do? My film professor had written on a piece of paper a bunch of names. At the top was this, names I recognized. I think like Lawrence Kasdan. There were a couple agents.
Okay.
Nobody returned my phone calls.
I was gonna say,
Nobody.
did you have meetings set up with these people?
No, no. And
Did you have
one
a
of the
place to live?
I did. I was going to stay for about a month with my college roommate's mother, who had a place in Los Angeles,
Okay.
and then I was going to be on my own.
All
And
right. So you
you
get
know,
out there. You get out there.
I get out there, and this has been a philosophy of mine that has repeated itself throughout my life: is just get in the middle of where I want to be and then figure it out.
I'm so glad you said that. Can we take a pause right there? I just did another interview recently. The one of the founders from Human Design, John Weiss. I'm sure he won't mind us mentioning him on this podcast because he was on the Riderflex podcast, and he said that something very similar. He said, "I want to encourage people." He said, "Get to where you want to be, and then figure out the rest, because where you want to be and where you want to live is so critical and will shape so many other things." And he just talked about that, how people are like, well, someday I want to be here. And he was like, screw that. Just go to where you want to be and then, figure it out. So that's great. I'm glad you did that.
Yeah, and it's LA is an industry town, and I started asking around and all these things. And one day I got a phone call at the house of that I was staying at, and it was the last person on that list. A good friend of mine to this day, his name's Patrick. He called me. He said, "Hey, man, I've been trying to call you for like a week, but your phone is always busy." And then the funny aside was that my friend's mother didn't have call waiting and was on the phone all day. And
Bummer. Wow.
right. So I was like, all right, I'll take whatever it is. I don't care what it is. I'll take the job. And so I drive out to Van Nuys with the address that they gave me. And if you've ever been to Van Nuys, I'm looking around. I'm like, this does not look like Hollywood. It's in the valley. It's all, it's all warehouses.
All right.
But I go into this nondescript warehouse, and there's like, at that point, and probably to this day, the most security I've ever seen. There's like, they're
really?
checking me out. They're like giving me badges, and they start walking me through all these security doors. And all of a sudden I get into this warehouse, and there's like all these like sculptures and robots and like eyeballs hanging out and like people welding things and signage. And it looks like the land of misfit toys.
Wow.
And I'm like, whoa, this is amazing. And it turned out to be a nondescript location for Disney's Imagineering, where they
really?
Okay. Where they build all the theme park rides, where they do all these really cool things. And they walked me back into a theater, and it was this private theater that was like a theater in the round. And it turned out that the job was, I was just driving film around for Disney, but it was 3-panel 70 millimeter, which if you're a film nerd is really, really cool.
Okay.
That's how they got that effect. And I sit down for lunch for the first day, and they, there's like 12 of us, and I'm literally sitting next to Ellen DeGeneres because she's the talent. And I'm like, okay, I'm in Hollywood, right? Like, I'm here. And
are you like, hey, Ellen, hi, I'm Mark. I'm from Michigan.
No, I was sitting there, and I said hi, and we didn't really talk much. And the cool thing about Ellen wasn't that I got to meet her. It was literally that I got to park next to her on the Disney lot. So yeah, because it was like movie star spot, Ellen, and then delivery driver, because I had, if you know anything about 70 millimeter film, it is huge. It's 70 millimeters.
So they had to give you a parking spot up close. Okay.
Yeah. And I had to carry these giant cans between editorial, different things on the studio, Technicolor, Deluxe. And at that, there was a lot of downtime. Like the orders were never ready. They were always like, come back, we're behind. And so I would take that opportunity. I'm on the lot, and I would literally walk up and down the aisles.
For sure. I would
of
too.
The bungalows. And I'd be like popping my head in. I'd be like, hey, I'm Mark. And making friends. And, that was another big lesson I learned, was just this like wonder of the work, having a sense of wonder, and also having a sense of naivete. Like, I think that like as we get older, we might be like, oh, I can't do that. I would be like interrupting them. I wouldn't, even today, I might not like walk up and down and just pop my head in someone's office and be like, hey, I'm Mark. I just probably wouldn't do it. And so one of the producers there took a liking to me, and I would then pop in and sit down. His name is John. Told him what I wanted to do. I really wanted to write and get more into making movies.
So you wanted to write. That's what you wanted to do.
That's what I want to do. And that's what I declared. And I said, and write, direct. I wanted to be a filmmaker. I mean, those were the people those were my heroes, right? Like that's who I had admired.
So not just write screenplays, but you wanted to direct at some point too at that time. Okay.
I wanted to be a filmmaker. There was no question.
All right.
And he slid in a very Hollywood moment, a Post-it note across the desk and said, call this guy. And I called them and I showed up for an interview, and it turned out to be Oliver Stone's production company.
Wow.
So I went and I interviewed for this job called story editor. I didn't know what it was. And like most young people, and, I was just like, I will do it. I will figure it out. I don't know what it is, but this is incredible.
Yeah. Story editor. What does that mean? I don't even know what that means.
Yeah. So a story editor effectively runs the story department. Okay. And the story department, if you have a production company, you're producing all sorts of things, not just stuff that Oliver was directly involved in, although he would have like a whole card of different projects he was just even looking at and toying with and developing and playing with and figuring out what his next project was going to be. But he was also producing movies. So we had, 30 different movies in development. We were always taking submissions in.
Wow.
At that time. Working with the agencies, there'd be like, hey, like it was always really exciting when they'd call you up and be like, hey, we have a hot new script. We're going out with it on this day. It's coming in. I would have to come in. I would have to make sure everyone got a copy. We would then meet and say, hey, we like this. We don't, that sort of thing. And it was interesting. It was.
Now, are you making decent money at this time? Now you got your own apartment?
I'm making just enough.
Just enough. All right.
Just enough. I'm, they're paying me in bonuses by like giving me movie tickets and sending me to premieres and like a lot of those kind of benefits. But
okay.
Not a lot of cash, right?
You're hanging in there. You're still driving the Oldsmobile.
Oh, I'm driving the Oldsmobile. And the thing was on its last legs, right? Because I had been driving it for film and driving.
All right. I just wanted to kind of get it. All right, cool.
No. This is not, it's glamorous in what it looks like from afar, but I mean, I'm not making any money, but I didn't care. And I'm getting screamed at. I'm like, I'm getting yelled at. Like, I'm just hoping that I'm not going to get fired. And one day I get called into the bullpen area, and there's about 11 people all standing around, and they're looking kind of stern. And I'm like, this is it. Like, this is the end of my Hollywood career. And they kind of flipped it, and they handed me this LL Bean tote bag, and I'm actually looking at it across my office right now that says Illusion on it. That was the name of the production company at the time. And my face just lit up because, and this is literally, I'm looking at it right now. This is like probably the business achievement I'm most proud of to this day. Because what that meant was like, hey, you're part of the team.
Oh,
you're one of us. That bag was so I could carry, because all the cool executives carried those bags full of scripts because they're so heavy, right? Like each script's about 110 pages, 120 pages.
Okay.
And you've got like 10 of them at any given time, plus all your stuff.
I see.
And I was like, I was so
I'm
happy.
Part of the club. You're like, I'm in the circle of trust now.
So happy that like they gave me this thing so I could take 20 scripts back and forth to my apartment, spend all weekend reading scripts, like every way. Like it didn't matter. I was so excited. And that was like this kind of big moment in my career that really signified I'd belong. And it's like a trophy. I'm looking at it right now.
That's cool. No, very cool. Very cool. Very cool. All right. And then then at some point you didn't stay in Hollywood. At some point I don't know how many years were you there before you thought, I'm going to do something else?
About 7. So I went on, I worked on with another really cool writing producing team, a guy named Marc Gutman, another guy named Zach Penn. Zach, you might recognize his name. He's written Ready Player One. He did a bunch of the X-Men movies. So super cool. But that was my dream. That was my dream to go to Hollywood. And this is an idea that I'm actually exploring, like even a little further. Like, what do we do when our dreams change, right? Like how do we pivot? And I realized that also part of my dream was having a full life outside of work. And I really wasn't doing that. I was doing nothing but working. I was head down. I was taking myself so seriously. I mean, it was, I was committed to this, this idea of growing my career, but I had this moment where I was like, what am I doing with my life? I'm not really doing the things that make me happy. And
Well, you weren't doing anything but working. It doesn't sound like. We're talking 70 hours, 70 hours a week type of deal. No social life, no hobbies.
yeah, totally. And also, like, at that time, another really well-known movie came out by a classmate of mine called American Pie. And I was so frustrated. I was so like, how can this guy write this like teenage sex comedy about these kids that abuse a pie? And he's like, all doing so well. And here I am trying to like do these Oliver Stone type movies. And what I realized was I should have been writing that movie, right? Like I should have been writing American Pie because that was my experience and how important it is to lean into our own story. I hadn't really done a whole lot. I got out of college. I'd been in the movie business, but it was pretty insular. I mean, I wasn't like Oliver Stone. I didn't go to Vietnam. I didn't live in this era of social unrest. I lived in this kind of teenage sex comedy, existence. And so, that was another thing that I now looking back have learned that how important it is just to lean into your own story and how important that is and how much value it has. I mean, you look at that story he wrote, that was his experience in high school. I mean, it's touched a lot of people. It's made a great career for him. Like, I mean, there's a ton of value there, both, intrinsic and actual monetary. So I realized that. And I knew what made me happy were simple things. We're getting outside. It was connecting with people. It was, hanging out with others. And so I came to Boulder to kind of take a break. And
how did you pick that? Can I just pause you right there?
Yeah.
You're in Hollywood or Los Angeles and you said, I need to find myself a little bit. How did you pick Boulder, Colorado to do that?
Yeah, I had long had a connection to the outdoors. I'd always loved getting outside. I actually worked at a kind of a famous outdoor retailer in Ann Arbor called Wilderness Outfitters. So I was like around, I loved gear, I loved touching critter and like putting hiking, getting people into hiking groups and camping stuff. So I'd always had this thing. My parents, we travel every summer, a couple of weeks out of the summer with our travel trailer, and Colorado was this thing that I always loved. But my wife and I, we looked on a little tour. We went to San Francisco, and I just kind of wanted to get out of the city. We looked at Portland. I loved Portland, but I was just so nervous about the rain. And I had a couple friends from college that lived here. And I remember the day we were on this exploratory trip. I was out at Copper Mountain. We were at the T-Rex bar. It was a beautiful sunny day. We were snowboarding and having a beer. And I looked at my friends and I said, so this is like just what you guys do on the weekend? And they were like, yeah. And I was like, it blew my mind that like this didn't have to be this thing that I waited for, for like 1 week a year, that I could integrate the things that I love to do into my life, and why not? Right. Yep. And, something I love to ask, and it's really core to our process and our business, is just this easy question of what if, what if, like, what if we lived here? Like, what would that look like? And so
now you had met, so you had gotten married before you left California?
Just before.
And did your wife, what did she do at the time?
She's a painter. So she had finished up a graduate program at the Art Center of Design in Pasadena. And that was also a good breaking point for us to leave.
I see.
That was kind of holding us there for a little bit.
Okay. All right. So you and her together, you guys were both ready to go somewhere else.
We were, and she's from the Midwest too. And, we weren't ready to go all the way back, but like coming this way seemed like a good thing. And, it was so different, it was like living in California, like things from the time change to the weather. Like I missed having seasons and things like that.
And then you moved to Colorado, which is a wonderful place. Best state in the country.
Best state in the country, and the thing that I love about it is like everyone loves living here.
Everybody does.
I grew up in an area where like everyone talks about how they want to leave in Detroit.
I know.
I love Detroit and I love being from there, but like everyone talks about like all they want to do is leave. And so again, living in a place that you love, like in building a life around that, I think that's more important than living in a place that supports your, like going to the career town or whatever, right?
It really is. That's a great point. It really is. And for the listeners, I know people that listen to the Riderflex podcast are like, oh God, he's always talking about how great Colorado is. Well, I hate to tell you, but it is.
Well, it is, and part of it's, you know, the obvious, the natural resources
Right. Yeah.
that we have, like the snow and the mountains and the
Yep.
sun, and that's great, you know. But really, when you have all these people that want to live here, that energy is so
Yes.
infectious, and that can-do attitude. Like no one,
Yes.
like if I came to you and said, "Hey, I want to start a business. I want to do this thing," you're gonna like
We,
most likely be like, "Great, cool.
yep.
How can I help you? That's
Absolutely.
awesome." You know,
Absolutely. Yep.
out on the, you know, I've worked for companies out on the East Coast, and they'd be like, "Oh, that's not gonna work." You know,
Yeah.
yeah, or like they're trying to like figure out every reason why it's not going to work. And so for me, that can-do attitude is so powerful, and it
Agreed.
buoys me, it lifts me up. And that's kind of a good segue into my story. So
It
I came
is. Yep.
here,
Yep.
and I was writing Saturday morning cartoons for Warner Brothers on a show called a
Okay.
cartoon version of Osmosis Jones.
Okay. So that's how you were paying the bills. They were letting you work remotely.
Yep. Well, but
Cool.
yeah, but I knew also, like, you know, what I had found, and it always been my dream to establish my career and go somewhere like kind of cool and and work remotely. But that wasn't at that time really common. Like you had to be in town
That's true.
chasing your next job and or
Okay.
working in a writer room. So I knew, but that by leaving it was gonna have an impact. But
Okay.
I did have a soft landing.
All right.
And at that time there was also something crazy happening. There was this like explosion of entrepreneurs. And so now like we talk about it, and entrepreneurs are everywhere, and we even have
Right.
celebrity entrepreneurs. But at that time it was just kind of percolating, you know, like
Mm-hmm.
Foundry was just kind of getting into
Mm-hmm.
doing their stuff and building the entrepreneur ecosystem. Like other people, like people were just starting, you know, like Pearl Street didn't look the way it looks, right? Like I remember we came and we felt like we couldn't find a decent meal, not because we were super foodies or food snobs, but when we lived in LA, it was like, you know, for $70, you can get like this amazing meal. And that felt like it at that time, that was a lot of money, but that was what
Right.
you do for a big, and we'd go out to a meal in Boulder, and it was like, you know, and so like this explosion of restaurateurs hadn't happened yet, but all that was happening, right? And so it was just lucky that the intersection of that, and I was looking around, I was like, wait a second, there's like all these people starting businesses and doing different things. And
Mm-hmm.
I was just looking again to get in the middle of something, to open up doors, to meet friends. And I had met some people, and I started working at a company called Rain Dance,
Okay.
which was an audio conferencing company in Colorado. The CEO was Paul Berberian, who's now the CEO of Sphero, another guy by the name of Todd Vernon, who has had multiple awesome exits over at Sovereign and Legit, and most recently Victor Ops. He just exited, and this other guy named Bryce Amberzunas. And so all this cool stuff was, I started working there, and I was answering what they called bells. You know, I was tech support for audio conferencing.
I see.
And it was this huge knock, and I had the least impressive college degree. Everyone there didn't care because everyone just wanted to be in Colorado. They had amazing benefits, and it was just this crazy launching off point. And from there, I was like, oh, this is a really interesting business. I started working in wholesale, and I spun out of there, and I started a company that resold audio conferencing because I had seen that I had made these relationships with suppliers. I had seen that there really, at the time, were like three main providers of audio conferencing, even like AT&T and Quest at the time, which became CenturyLink, and and Verizon. They didn't have their own infrastructure. They were selling these services, but they were procuring them from, you know, one of three big players. Also, there was this great opportunity for small business, which was coming up and needing all these types of new technologies.
Right.
They never had access to them. And so I could basically go, and I made arrangements with the suppliers to commit to certain, you know, I'm going to buy minutes from you. I'm going to repackage them and sell them out to a small business.
Now, was this
Audience.
company called Lighthouse Conferencing?
It is. Yeah.
Okay. And did you start that kind of on the side while you were still working a regular job, or did you just go all in and quit your job to get that rolling?
I went all in and quit my job. You know, sitting, a big part of why I did that even was I love to go back to Michigan in the summer. I still spend 6 to 8 weeks there. And I was trying to think about how can I architect my life to support that dream. And so I didn't
see.
do it all at once. But for me, entrepreneurship has really followed this idea that it's not the purpose, it's the tool. you know, and that is at a personal level. It's the tool for me to do the things that I want to do, but also at a macro level, right? It's the tool to do great things. It's the tool to change the world. Like being an entrepreneur isn't the purpose. It's like when we do it correctly, in my opinion, we're solving really cool problems. We're helping shape the world through entrepreneurship, and it becomes this tool where we can affect change and do really great things. Whether that's something like, a great, affecting change, like in a device. Like, I'm not trying to say it has to be this thing that's like, clean water, or clean water. So, yeah.
So Lighthouse Conference. So did that, and it started making a good living for you pretty quick?
Pretty quick. Yeah.
Okay.
I was really, really fortunate. Because of my relationships, I had a low barrier to entry. I didn't have a lot of CapEx. It was just like, hey, go out and sell and start to build a brand. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what my differentiator was. I just knew that if I could acquire customers, the economics would work in my favor. And
let me take a pause just for a minute for the listeners. So there's a common thread here as you've listened to Marc talk, and it ties to the word relationships. And it goes all the way back to having a relationship with the professor or the counselor in college that trusted you enough to say, here's a list of names. When you go out to LA, call these people, contact these people. And then another relationship that you had with your roommate to allow you to say, I'm going to let you live with my mother while you go out there. Another relationship. Then another relationship that you built when you got, with the producer that gave you the opportunity. And then you get to Boulder, and again, you build relationships, and those contacts help you get Lighthouse Conferencing going. So often, especially with millennials, not to pick on millennials, but like you can't just have a high IQ. You can't just work hard. Like if you don't manage relationships and networking properly, you're not going to move as fast. You're not going to be as successful. It's just so critical to manage relationships. And that's been a common thread out of everything you've said so far. Cause I'm assuming you're right. You had some connections and relationships, and to get Lighthouse Conferencing going, you're just like, Hey, Bobby, I got this idea, and boom, you're going.
100%. That's such an interesting insight. I've never put those dots together. So I appreciate that, Steve. Yeah. I mean, for me, that's how it's always been. It's always been this idea of relationships,
yes,
and going out. But I want to make the point, like, they're all relationships that you've put out there that I've worked to build.
Exactly. Exactly.
My dad never called anyone and was like, hey, hook Marc up. Like, I didn't have that, like I didn't have, like, I was always envious of the kids that their parents like paid for their internship, or
right. Yeah.
like really gave them the footing. It was just like, hey, I'm going to figure it out as long as I can meet my bare minimum needs financially. And that was also really a great thing. Like, I didn't have the luxury of not meeting my bare financial needs, which is this really great thing because it forces you to choose. It forces you to, do different things and make a living and see how the world works. And there's some risk and vulnerability. You got to hold that job. So even if it sucks, if you're not loving the actual work, you're like, I got to stick this out until I find a better option. And I think that there's something super powerful in that, because had I had a cushion, I might have been like, I don't like this because I don't like how I'm being treated. I don't like long hours. I don't like doing the crap work. But that's also, like, looking back, that's what makes you have the ability to do great things and have a career. And you do need to do those things. And I just recently spoke at the University of Michigan, and someone someone asked me and said, what kind of advice do you have for me starting out? And I could say something like, hey, don't take yourself so serious. Don't work so hard. Don't chase just the money. Don't chase just the title. All these things, which are probably true, except it's only true now that I've done that myself, and I've made those mistakes. And I don't want to rob anyone of that experience, because sometimes you have to do those things, depending on where you are in your career, to get to where you want to be, and it's not this, hey, don't do what I did or something like that. Like, sometimes we do need to just be so head down and focused on our career and chasing the wrong things, because that'll spin us into the right things. Now, that being said,
good point.
That being said, I don't want anyone to be super focused on the wrong things, but I also don't want to rob you of your growth and your experience, because we all have our own story and we all have to get to where we want to go. And if it were all easy,
It wouldn't. Yeah, exactly. So you, Lighthouse Conferencing, you ran that for what, 10 years? And is that still open, or did you sell it or close it, or what happened with that?
10 years. We just sold it this past summer. I never
Oh,
thought, my strategy was at the time, there was a ton, when I started it, there was a ton of consolidation going on in the space. And so I was like, hey, I'm going to build this up. I'm going to get to critical mass. I'm probably going to go raise some money. I'm going to acquire a bunch of smaller players, and then I'm going to sell it to one of those three big players.
okay.
I had seen other people do that. There seemed to be a really great roadmap for that. And I didn't see, and we take it for granted now, but now like things like Zoom or Google Hangouts,
Yep.
or, if you're an Amazon Web Service customer, they have a telecommunication platform, I think called Chime. Like, just didn't see that. Skype, right?
Yep.
We had kind of known Skype, but man, that changed the industry,
Changed
And so
everything.
like a good lesson in entrepreneurship was also be okay running that business that you're getting into, that you, even if the plan is to exit, because I had this business that I thought had like a 3 to 4 year, that was the business plan.
Mm-hmm.
And again,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't love conferencing. It was the tool, not the purpose.
Yep.
To use that. I knew the business. It allowed me to do some things. And I was running that business.
Should you have exited after about 4 or 5 years? And did you pass up a couple of opportunities to exit, or no?
No.
Okay.
I look back, that business created a life for me. It did so many wonderful things.
Great. That's cool.
It never, and I think this is an interesting lesson. Like, did it reach the, did I exit for $10 million? No, I didn't. That was kind of the plan.
Well,
But what it did do is it provided a great life
yep.
for me and my family. It cash flowed amazing. I put a lot of money away. I had a small sort of double or a base hit exit, which is great. I learned so much through entrepreneurship, and it was this lifeline that then put me in contact with a group that has been incredibly impactful for me, called Entrepreneurs Organization, which, I'm not here to promote the group, but what it did is it put me in touch with the people that were like me, founders and other
Gotcha.
business owners. And,
Yep.
and through that, and through self-exploration, about 7 years ago, I was like, look, I have this conferencing business. I don't love it. And I want to do something with my life that feels more like me. And that's when I started WILDSTORY, which is the business I'm doing now. But I didn't even, I was kind of, people were like, oh, you were in Hollywood. Can you help me with my story? I didn't know what that meant, but I was helping. I was doing some consulting. I was telling people, hey, you should do this, that. And I actually started the business as a PR firm, because that was the only way in my head I could see, hey, how do you tell stories for people? And I learned how to do PR, and I realized I didn't like that. Like, it just wasn't like, it just wasn't sitting well with me. It was traditional PR, and there's nothing against PR. A lot of that was probably a fault of mine, taking a lot of clients that didn't have PR worthy things and trying to help them, and they were disappointed. And so I took a step back, and I continued to work with clients. And I realized that the clients that I loved working with, and where I had the most impact, and things I love to do, I was a brand strategist. That's what I was doing. I was helping to build their brand and tell their story through different channels, whether it be culture, brand strategy, or content. And so really
that is interesting. So you weren't traditionally, like, you weren't really a trained marketer, right? You weren't a marketing / advertising professional, so to speak, but your writing skills, your curiosity, your love for the story, your people skills that allows you to develop these relationships, all kind of ties together to help entrepreneurs figure out how to tell their story better and tie it to their brand. I see how all that fits together. It's so fascinating. When I studied your profile, I thought, well, how did he end up? I don't understand how he got there, but you've tied it together nicely.
Yeah. So this perspective of entrepreneurship and storytelling, and it took me a while. It wasn't, I don't want to sit here and say like, oh, I totally figured it out. Like, I had a hard time like being categorized as a brander or a marketer, because I was like, to your point, I was like, I've never. Yeah.
That's what I was trying to do. Categorize you. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I think categorization is good. It allows us to understand what others do, and that was a part where my business struggled for a while, because I was like, I'm a storyteller. I help tell your story. Well, if I say that can mean, like, if you ask 10 different people, what does telling the story in your business mean? You're going to get 10 different answers. It's like, Hey,
Yeah.
it's branding, it's marketing, it's my CEO speech, it's our culture internally. It's like when we do our earnings announcement, like you could just go on, like it can mean different things. And so getting clear, and there's a great book called Made to Stick, and they talk about this idea of a schema, right? We have a schema in our heads that when I say horse, you all of a sudden have this image of a horse, and it's probably an idealized image. You're probably not thinking, although there are 20,000 different variations of horse that you could be thinking of. Well, same thing with the way that we put ourselves in buckets. Like no one wants to be put in a bucket, right? Like I was like, no, I'm special. I worked in Hollywood. I tell stories, but like that was confusing. And the
Yeah.
second that I put myself into a bucket and say, hey, I'm a brander, people are like,
Yeah.
all right, I get that. And we can start to have that conversation. Now, how I approach is from a storytelling standpoint, and that's unique and different. But you
And
know,
Wild Story was created in 2013 as you don't call it a advertising agency, branding agency. You don't call it that, do you? How do you, in one sentence, how do you describe it?
we're a brand storytelling firm that helps turn your story into a brand story that helps to amplify your business and connect with more customers and ultimately drive profits. So
Okay. So right there, I just want to take a pause. Everybody needs your help. And when I say everybody, it's really frustrating for me every time I visit with a new executive. Let's say they're a client for Riderflex that we're going to meet because we're trying to sell them recruiting services, or it's an executive coming on the Riderflex podcast. Either way, I'm having to do homework on the company and the executive, right?
mhm.
I can't tell you, 75% of the time I will click on the website and I'll go, okay, all right, can I, what are you doing here? Like, what's the story? What do you do? And it does not go fast. Like it's not quick. So often I will look at a website or look at the social media and I'll hang up the phone and I'll call my partner and I'll go, I still don't know what these guys do because the story's not right. The story's not clear. So
Yep.
my point is, I think a lot of brands could use your help. I don't think people do a good enough job telling a clear, concise, short enough story to keep people's attention long enough to really understand what they do. Anyway, that's my read on the situation. Now I'll let you
No, it's
elaborate.
100%. And it kind of goes back to that conversation we were just having about like understanding what category you fit into. Who are you for? Who are you not for?
Right.
Like you want people when they come to your profile or your website to immediately say like,
Yep.
you're for me or you're not for me. And your
Right.
story forces people to choose. And that's like such a powerful
Yes.
idea, and we do want people to not choose us instantly if they're not the right fit, because that saves time, that
Yes.
saves our
Yep.
energy. We don't have to, waste time, chasing down prospects that we know aren't going to be a good fit. And it
Right.
also helps to, build that referral business when people instantly know who you're for. If I'm like talking about, hey, I need yoga clothes and all this kind of stuff, like someone's like inevitably going to be like, oh, you should go to Lululemon or Prana, right? Like we know, like no one's going to go, like you should go to Brooks Brothers. That doesn't happen. And it should be that simple, it
Should
should be
be.
that clean. Or, we use the idea of, hey, we're at a cocktail party and Steve says, hey, Mark, who you for? And I'm like, well, it's really, we work with, kind of a really specific kind of client. We typically work with like outdoor lifestyle and tech companies that are at a interesting stage of growth. Typically they've had an event, and they're really trying to realign with who they are and who they're for.
And when you say they've had an event, just for the listeners, they've had a seed round or a Series A round that they have enough capital to actually hire firms like Wild Story to help them. Basically, is that what you mean?
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. First round of capital, but it could be a startup too. I mean, that was just an example,
Yep.
of something that I might say, or I could say, hey, like, look, we work with startups getting off, and they need to really get aligned on who they are, and we have an offering for them, and
Great.
because for us, brand, it all begins with the words you use, and that's something, your brand and your brand story isn't your logo, it's not your colors, it's not your website. That's all part of it. But it really, starts with, answering some fundamental questions like, why are we here? Who are we for? What's our vision? What's our backstory? I mean, those things all go into telling your story. And
Mm.
there are all these signals that we're telling different people through different, mediums, whether it be a podcast, whether it be social, whether it be our website, whether it be the client onboarding experience, all those things. And why that's so important is, as human beings, we are just biologically designed to say no.
That's true.
And it's a defense mechanism.
It's a defense. It is. Yep. It's a defense mechanism.
And so we want to say no. And, have you ever had the experience, like Steve, like maybe you and I, because I do this all the time. I always go meet for coffee. Like someone's like, hey, let's go to Ozo, right? And you sit down, and the bolder thing to do, and you have coffee and you meet someone, and then I go back home and my wife says like, hey, how was that meeting with Steve? And I was like, and she's like, well,
I do it all the time.
Yeah. She's like, what was wrong with him? And I'm like, I don't know. Just, I can't articulate it right. Well, that's just your spidey senses where there's incongruency in the story that we were receiving. So that's what we're, so when you think about that from your branding, your marketing, and how people are perceiving you, and they start to get that like kind of queasy tummy, those, and they're like, they bounce and they don't buy, and that right there is what you want to avoid, because even best case scenario, when you send all the right signals, they still want to say no, and you still need to convince them. So you don't want to like have people, thinking that you're not for them.
Yeah. So it's not, so your service not only helps them tell the story for their brand, but it helps them tell their own story when they're meeting with prospects, right? I mean, you can probably help them in both ways. You're so right. My partner and I, Scott, meet with prospects and potential clients, all the time, right? And you're right. Usually to get a contract signed, you're meeting them for coffee or happy hour or dinner or whatever. I cannot tell you, Mark, how often, more than 50% of the time, we'll be driving back home, separate vehicles. Scott will call me, or I'll call him and go, God, why so many, why they get that, it was okay. Why people get that feeling? I think personally, they get that feeling because everybody's lying. Everybody's faking stuff. Everybody's like making crap up. Like, just be real, just be authentic. You don't have to try to pretend like you're somebody you're not. Don't feed me full of BS. I don't need all that. Just keep it real, bro, and we'll be just fine. That's where I get turned off when people are telling their stories, when they start feeding me full of crap. Anyway, sorry, I went off on a tangent.
No, totally. I call that the BS meter, right? And like you think about back when, you get on the airplane and on the back of the screen, the CEO from United's telling you, come fly the friendly skies. And, in parallel, you have someone getting dragged off a plane. You're like, like, what do you mean? Right?
Yeah,
like,
what do you mean?
This doesn't line up. And that's like a real clear example, but it happens all the time where we call BS either directly or just intuitively on a brand who's not living up to the promise. And so, there's never been a time like today where we are so clued in and tuned in and informed on what brands are doing. I don't know if you've been following what's happening with backcountry.com by any chance. Have you seen that at all?
No.
So backcountry.com is a retailer that has grown to be quite a large online retailer. I think they're doing like around $500 million is what I saw in revenue. And there was an article that came out in the Colorado Sun not more than 2 weeks ago, maybe 10 days ago, that was an expose about that they were aggressively trying to defend the name Backcountry and take that as a trademark, and as a result, putting a lot of small businesses out of business through legal means, because they would be like Backcountry Coffee or Backcountry Jeans or whatever.
I see.
The point of that story is
they can't do that. They can't do that, can they? I mean, there's probably so many businesses with Backcountry in the title.
Well, they had been, and this in creating and putting businesses out of business. And when this article came out, because of where we are in a digital sharing kind of world,
right? Oh man,
the community rallied. Someone here in Colorado by the name of John Miller started a Facebook group. I think the thing's up within a week to 20,000 people. People are boycotting the company because and what I've ascertained is through all the comments is just, it's not so much that, they don't like the legal means and the bullying and stuff, but they feel like that they were duped, because they feel like that Backcountry and what it once stood for from the original owners before it went to this private equity group stood for the backcountry and outdoors and all these values that we hold so dear. And now they find out, no, that this is just a company that's, funded on profit and greed and not honoring the values of what we call the backcountry. And it's been this movement. And so that's just a small example of like how quickly your fortunes can change in this world.
Right.
If you're not being authentic and true to your mission and who you are and your community, right? Like their customer are all these outdoor people, and they were not clear on the values of their customer. They were more concerned about the values of themselves and protecting a trademark. And it's gotten them in real trouble. Since then, the CEO's come out and said, hey, like we're dropping lawsuits, but and we don't know where this is all going to land. But those people, to my surprise, are so unforgiving. They're like once you burn that trust, like I'm very much a second chance person. I would give them a second chance. But the community by and large is speaking, and they will not until there's like major reparations. And that's probably not going to happen.
And by the way, speaking of stories like that, is your story real? Is your story authentic? If you're an executive for a company and you're listening to this podcast, I would challenge you or encourage you, next time you go to the office or next time you're on the company webpage, just pull up the mission statement and values and just ask yourself, like, wow, is that really what we're doing? Is that really who we are?
Yeah. And it's a great point, Steve. I mean, the last part in our process is like live the brand, right? So
live it.
You can design all the stuff. You can talk about it. And that's actually the fun stuff. That's the easy stuff. Because we get in a room and we do all this cool stuff.
Yeah,
and,
right.
And then you get a new visual identity. So you get a cool Patagonia shirt with the logo, right? And you get stickers and like a website. That's all really, really fun and exciting. But the stuff that really makes that work and have effect and drive your business is you need to live that brand day in, day out. And you may even like fall off the wagon, right? Like think about your own core values. When you do something that's not in alignment, that's not to say that you're always perfect, but that you can always use your values and your brand and your mission and your vision to realign and get back going in the right way and point your compass in the right way.
What's that like for you? And I know we're stretching our time here. A few more questions. Do you have a few more minutes? Just a few more minutes, Mark? I know we're almost out of time.
I do, yes.
What's that like for you to go into the CEO's office, a client of yours? You know that you need to have this heart to heart with the CEO and tell them that, hey man, you're not living your own story. Like you're not living your own mission and values. Like you're calling them on it, right? So to speak. But at the same time, they're a client and they're paying you, so you don't want to piss them off, right? That's a delicate dance, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, usually they bring me in because they feel like they have some sort of problem, and they might not know how to articulate it. They might be like, "Hey, we're not being perceived correctly. People think we do something different. Our sales just aren't trending in the right direction internally. Our culture's messed. Like there's a whole bunch of different things that the problem that they think they have and that they do have. But when I come back and do an assessment, or I'm looking at things, it usually rings true. I have had times where people are like, no, we're fine. And then there's, at that point, there's probably nothing for us to talk about. Like, it's, you need to understand that you have a problem, and that you're willing to work at it. And I'm very honest about what it will do and what it won't do. And that it is a process. It's like, if you think that you just need a logo, then please don't hire me.
Right.
You should probably go to 99 Designs and get a logo and be very happy. And that's a really good use of your funds.
Right.
But if you really want to affect change, if you want to build a brand that lasts, I mean, there's some brands that don't even really need branding,
or if they want to pivot, right? If they want to pivot and they need to adjust their story, they can call you.
100%. Yeah. Because we need to realign, and that all starts, with, what's that pivot trying to accomplish and things like that.
So it's WILDSTORY.com. Is that the best way to go about making contact, or do you want to give another email or phone number for the listeners on this show?
Steve, that's a great way to contact me. But also, if you want to contact me directly by email, it's Marc, MARC, @WILDSTORY.com. And just, make note that you heard me on the Riderflex podcast.
That'd be great.
That way I'll know, and I'll know what we talked about and how you're approaching the conversation and coming to me. And certainly would like to put out there that, normally we charge for consults and things like that. But for anyone on the Riderflex podcast that would like to have like a 15-minute consult and reach out, and I'm happy to do that via the phone. And so go ahead and reach out to me at no charge, and we'll just see where I might be able to help you.
Great.
Not a sales pitch, but literally a consultation. If you have an issue you're dealing with, I'd be more than happy to do that.
That's awesome. One thing I just last point I want to make here. You going back to a little bit earlier in the podcast, you are talking about your first company, Lighthouse Conferencing. I just want to say this for the listeners. I think this is pretty powerful stuff. You see in the news or in the media, you're like, oh, these guys started a business and they had a fantastic exit and they sold it for $200 million and now they're rich and life is great. First of all, that's a very tiny percentage of the population that actually happens to. That's number one. And number two, like, to be happy, it doesn't have to go down that way. I mean, you can have, I don't know, an auto repair shop, right? That maybe have an auto repair shop that does $500,000 a year, and you run it and you're the owner and you take home 150 and you get to go on vacation whenever you want and you get to live the life you want and you get to live in Boulder, Colorado, because that's where you want to live. And life is great. Like, you can be an entrepreneur and a business owner and live where you want to live and do the things you want to do personally and be very happy. It does not have to end up in this fairy tale BS. Oh, I sold it for 500 million and I'm rich. It doesn't have to be that way, right? To live a happy life. And I just think that's really important for people that want to own a business to hear. Not everybody's going to build it and sell it and cash out. In fact, 95% of them won't do that. And so it's important to know you can be happy in other ways as well.
100%. And, I was caught up in that kind of story, that narrative as well, that, hey, I had to build this up. I had to have an exit. I had a real unhealthy relationship with my business for a while. I mean, I thought it was a bad business. I was like, why am I not growing it to a point I can exit? Like,
right.
All this kind of conversation. At one point, I'm not really sure what triggered it. I had this I was like, this business is like the Giving Tree, that book by Shel.
Right.
Like all I do is take from it and I treat it so poorly. Like I cut off its limbs and I take cash and I go on vacations and I support my family with it. And I have this life that I've always dreamed of, yet I'm treating this business poorly. And much to your point, it was a great business. It was an amazing business. And,
awesome.
I think everyone else should be so lucky to have a business like that.
Marc, you've been awesome. I'd love to keep you on for longer. I know we didn't even get through all the questions, but some really inspirational stuff. Thank you so much for sharing and for being on the Riderflex podcast. I really appreciate it. And just remember, folks, if you need adjustments on telling your story for the brand or personally or whatever, WILDSTORY.com. And Marc Gutman can help you, and he can help your business. Marc, thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Steve, thank you. It was such a pleasure. I agree. I wish we could go longer, and maybe we'll do part 2.
Absolutely. Take care, my friend.
Thank you.
The Riderflex podcast features entrepreneurs, business executives, and the stories behind how they got there, as well as daily tips on career advice and job interviews. Our show can be heard just about anywhere these days, but you can visit Riderflex.com and click on the podcast page to hear all the previous episodes and learn more about the recruiting and consulting services we provide. Contact us at the email address info@riderflex.com or 888-964-5876. Thanks so much for listening, and if you enjoy our show, please be sure to subscribe to our channel and like the episodes.